if you're one of those few people that is voicing feedback and voicing ideas, I think that really does help you stand out, right? Because you're looking again to add value from your position and being like more in that win-win type of mindset.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Paid Search NYC podcast. Today, very excited to be chatting to Eric Frazzano, who is a paid search expert in New York. He's held various senior paid search roles at agencies like MediaMonks, 3Q, Code3. So he's very well positioned to chat about today's subject, which is how do you thrive in an agency world? So very excited to get into that. But before we do, Eric, thanks and welcome.
Matt, thanks for having me on. Excited to be here.
Of course. Now, I know this is actually something you've given training and spoke about as a subject before. So you have an established kind of 5-part framework, which is great, and excited to get into that. I guess my setup before we get in is working in agencies is challenging. But both of us have been in agencies quite a while. We've all probably experienced the same challenges around resourcing, recruiting, talent, industry changes, things moving incredibly quickly. And I think there are definitely things within this framework that I would have loved to have known about earlier on in my career.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you feel the same. So I guess I just kind of wanted to set up with that acknowledgement that working in agency is hard. It's certainly not easy. And I think frameworks like this are really useful to help people understand some of the, not hacks or tricks, but if you were to really think about ways to leverage your time and effort, what has the kind of the biggest return on that in terms of your likelihood to progress or do well within an agency?
Yeah, for sure. Hopefully we can give a little bit of a blueprint to what we've learned throughout our careers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess let's just dive in. So part 1 of the 5, you had thinking big, which sounds quite broad. So let's break it down. Why is that the first one, and kind of what does that involve?
Yeah, so I think when you're working in an agency, bigger picture, it's really kind of a partnership, right? So you got a job, the agency's got a resource, right? You want to find a path to what works best for each of you, right? So when you're thinking about advancing in your career, whether it's getting a promotion, getting that next raise, landing your dream job, it all starts with understanding what's the other side, what's the agency looking to get out of this, right? So I think it's really important early on, if you're just starting at a company or if you're getting, further into your career, to understand what's the direction of the business at a whole, right? Where are they trying to head? And then think a little bit about what your bigger picture aspirations are and try to find that common ground. How can you guys align your own priorities with that of the business? Because ultimately, that's what leads to those win-wins, to those successful partnerships.
Got it. I'm trying to think of examples there as you're talking, and maybe tell me if this is a good one. But an example of a higher level goal or aim for the agency might be, we just do really great work. We provide great service and do great work. And then for you as an individual, it's I want to work on things that are cutting edge, innovative. I want to learn and grow. And it feels like those two things come together well, because in having that desire to work on new things and learn new things and be innovative, that translates into good work for clients. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about, or
100%? Yeah, I think we could take that a step further, and finding a niche within your agency is a great way to add value to them, but then also separate yourself from other people. So if the agency is really focused on becoming more innovative, right? Maybe your niche can be leading all beta testing across the company, right? And gathering a list of what's out there that's new that we can test, right? And putting together a framework for the rest of the organization to go out there and test it effectively, get some learning so that the agency can repurpose those into case studies, right? And then kind of build their image as being a cutting edge innovator in the space.
Yeah, for sure. how is there any way to break down? So let's say you start an agency, or you've been at leads for a couple of years,
Sure.
and like you understand this concept of thinking big and like trying to align goals, but you aren't quite sure what it is that, whether it's your niche or what it is you're interested in. Is there a way to kind of find that, or does it just come from first being very curious, I guess, and willing to try new things, or is there a different way you can kind of think of like how to find that thing?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways you can kind of uncover that. I find one of the best ones is at all hands meetings, right? So if you've got a company-wide meeting, generally speaking, you're going to talk about what the goals are for the business, right? How are we doing against those goals, right? And you can get a lot of little nuggets in there as to what's the direction that we're heading in, right? Are we trying to pivot towards more commerce, right? Or are we trying to focus more on TikTok as like an emerging channel, right? There's countless different things you might find in there, but generally those company-wide meetings will be a good starting point. If your company does do any kind of town halls or ask me anythings, those are also a great opportunity to literally ask, right? Like in a safe space, if it's anonymous, hey, I'm really curious, where are we heading, right? Or what's the main focus? What's one thing that I could do to help us reach that? So those are good opportunities. And then sometimes just talking to your manager, right? Maybe it's after one of those meetings, you have a hunch on the direction that the company is trying to go in, but you really want to drill down and ensure that you're on the right track. Have those conversations, right? Or look for a mentor as well that's on the leadership team and try to connect with them one-on-one and pick their brain on what they're focused on.
Yeah, I really like that all hands example, because that they're usually delivered by people who are very senior, and so you really get that higher level, like what is important to the business. And so if you can align yourself to that, like you say, if it's a new and emerging side channel, then being able to demonstrate your interest in that and try and add value and be seen as someone who's keen to get into that, I think is great advice.
100%.
Yeah. Okay. Part 2, leveraging resources. In fact, before I pivot to that, anything else on think big?
No, I think we hit it.
No, we got it. Okay, cool. Yeah, part 2 had leveraging resources. So break that down. What do you mean? What does that involve?
Yeah, so I think when you're in an agency, and obviously every agency is slightly different, right? Whether you're a boutique one or a holding co, large company, whether you're specialized or kind of like generalist agency. But one thing that I think all of them have in common generally is that you have a lot more resources than you would say if you're in-house, right? If you're doing paid search, for example, and you're in-house, you might be the only person doing it. You might have like 1 or 2 other people doing it, right? There might be one person doing paid social, or you might be doing all paid media yourself, right? The point being that there's a lot smaller circles, right? And there's a lot fewer resources. So when you're in an agency, you really want to take advantage of the fact that you have a wealth of knowledge across different areas within digital marketing, for example, right? So generally you're going to have like a paid social specialist, right? You also might have subject matter experts. So within paid search, maybe there's somebody that's really good at lead gen, or someone that knocks it out of the park on e-commerce businesses, right? You really want to take advantage of that. So if you're just starting off and you're on an e-com account, go find that person that has a wealth of experience in that space and pick their brain. Figure out like what they did for their clients that worked really well that you could bring to the table for the one that you're working on. Or if you run into an issue where you're on a client call and you find that there's some friction between the reporting that you're providing for them. Maybe you've got a reporting and analytics team that you can tap in and explain, here's the point of friction that we've got with the client. Is there anything that you could do to build in like a new view to our dashboard? Or would you mind, jumping on a call with us to break down the situation with the client? It's really just like connecting the dots, right? And focusing more on knowing the right person to go to rather than trying to be the jack of all trades yourself. Because when you're in an agency, you want to be able to take advantage of the fact that you have people that are probably better at everything outside of your area of expertise than you are, right? So how do you leverage those resources?
Yeah, makes total sense. And I feel like most good agencies will break down those barriers a little bit for you in terms of making sure that cross-functional teams are speaking to each other, collaborating, etc.
Yeah.
But there's always a level further or beyond that you can do yourself by reaching out to an individual, like you say, asking for them to sort of break down what they do, or just getting them to explain a little bit more about a particular subject they might know more about. My question, I guess, controversial subject, but how does that differ if you're sort of working from home versus in office? It feels like that sort of thing, especially if you're early in your career, is probably easier in office versus working from home. But it's not impossible working from home. You know, you can still reach out to people on chat, but feels easier if in the office.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I started my career in office 5 days a week. So I do think that there's some benefit to that in-person interaction, right? Because you might be on the paid search team, but you've got the paid social team sitting like right across the way, and you can go pick their brain, for example. But I've also started jobs fully remote. So I think when you're in that situation, you kind of alluded to it a little bit there, but rely on Slack, rely on Teams, whatever your kind of internal communication might be. Every agency is different, but I think a lot of times there'll be different channels that you can go to where you can tap into those types of experts. And I think it's also important to take advantage of the relationship you have with your manager, right? Pick their brain a little bit and say, you're just starting at a new company, or you changed roles maybe. Who's like the top person that you go to if you got a question on programmatic, right? And try to get some insight from them. And then just reach out to that person directly and say, hey, do you have a few minutes to chat, or explain kind of the situation that you're in, and see if they might be able to add value that way. It takes a little bit more intentionality, I think, when it's remote, right? It's not as easy as just tapping someone on the shoulder behind you. You do have to take a little bit of an extra step there. But it's still totally feasible.
Yeah. I wonder what I'm trying to think what the fear is around not doing that. Like, what are the reasons people don't do that? And I wonder if part of it is, feeling like it should be something you already know the answer to. So that fear of like being found out as someone who doesn't know something they should do, or if it's reaching out to people that you don't have a relationship with, and just that kind of fear of like cold messaging someone, or just not wanting to bother people, I guess, is probably the other thing I can think of. How do you advise to like get over all of those?
Yeah, I think it kind of comes back to what I was saying at the beginning in like our thinking big kind of setup there, right? If you are looking for help from somebody else, think about it as a two-way street or a partnership, right? Like, if I need to get an answer from them, what's some value that I could bring from my side as well, right? So that it's not just like, you're bothering them, or you sound like you don't know what you're doing. Establish that you're an expert at what you do, and you recognize that they are an expert at what they're doing, right? And offer some kind of an interaction where you both can benefit, right? So something that I used to do a lot with my direct reports is people, when they're in an agency, generally have an interest in channels outside of their own. So a lot of the companies I worked at did have specialists within paid search track, within the paid social track. Very common for people on paid search to be interested in like how paid social works, or vice versa, right? So I would oftentimes just connect the two people and say, hey, so-and-so is really interested in learning paid social. I know that you're killing it at what you're doing. And I heard that you might be interested in learning a thing or two about Google, right? And then you just set them up and kind of create that partnership or that mentorship between them.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, the whole two-way street thing. Yeah. Okay, great. I kind of want to get to part 3 because it's probably one of my favorite ones. The third one is maintaining a growth mindset, which talk about a lot with people, and it's so important in this industry just because of how quickly things move. if you don't have a growth mindset, it's almost like you don't maintain a base level. You actually fall behind.
Right.
And some of these things are talking about how to like thrive, but this is one where it's like, this is absolutely mandatory, really. So yeah, I mean, break it down. When we say maintaining a growth mindset, what does that involve?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, right? But at the end of the day, when we think about the greater context of the conversation, like how do you thrive? How do you stand out from the pack? One of the best ways is demonstrating that growth mindset, right? Because it will really separate you from the people that are just getting the job done versus the people that are crushing it, that are, delivering excellent results for their clients. It starts with just a general curiosity, right? You mentioned yourself, the industry is always changing, right? So you need to be curious about what that means, what's next, right? I think it all starts for me with just following your favorite industry publication, right? Take note of what's changing and shifting within the space. Stay on top of new developments. Tune into like the keynote events and see, what your platform or your partner is planning for the next 12 months, right? Like what's bigger picture that's going to be changing. Part of it is also, continuing to be a self-starter. So nobody's going to really require you to read those articles or require you to attend that webinar or seek out that extra training. Part of that has to come from within. And that's kind of how you start to separate yourselves, because not everybody's going to have that same drive or that same motivation to continue to grow and to continue to learn. Some people will kind of hit that level of complacency where it's like, hey, I'm doing well. I'm pretty happy with where I'm at. But if you're able to take it into that next drive, I think that really helps to separate yourself and differentiate a little bit. I think you also just need to recognize that it's a long journey, right? You got to be able to stay positive, and take all the ebbs and flows and continue to have that mindset that, mistakes, failures all lead to growth at the end of the day.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that come to mind there. So I think you kind of said it, or you may have actually said it, the importance of doing things that you don't actually get told to do. Like there's going to be a lot of things within your job that your manager's going to tell you to do, frameworks, documents, but there's a lot of things that you're just not going to get told to do, and that's where it becomes how proactive are you being in doing some of these things, and having a growth mindset is probably one of the biggest areas where you can be proactive. As you said, staying on top of publications, following people on LinkedIn, keynotes, events, virtual events, just staying on top of all of that is so important. And it's not necessarily someone's going to come behind you and say, you need to do this, you need to read this article. Like you have to be able to, I'm used to it there, self-starter, to do all that. Super, super important. And I think the other thing you mentioned before is like self-reflection. So being able to, I guess, have that sort of self-critical, self-awareness element as well. Like, am I delivering on these things? Do I really have a growth mindset, or am I kind of just maintaining? And that's tricky because sometimes you can't let yourself. You might need a third party to sort of help you. Balance how accurate that is. But I think that's really important as well. The other thing that actually came to mind was we're talking about growth mindset from a industry specific point of view, so like industry news. But what about outside of that? So an example would be I know people that have done like public speaking courses or softer skill type things. I mean, I think we probably agree that is also very important. But is it that if you have to choose one over the other, there is one you can choose over one or the other, or is it kind of like they're both of similar importance?
I would say that they're both equally important, right? I think there are a lot of aspects of the job that are more generalized, right? Like in most agencies, you're going to be client facing, you're going to have that interaction. So part of it is like relationship building, right? And understanding the art of going beyond just the small talk or beyond the numbers, but actually like generally getting to know somebody, and showing an interest in their life and their business, that's a skill in of itself, right? And that's not necessarily something you're going to learn from the thought leaders on LinkedIn within paid search, for example, or reading articles. Some of that is like outside of that realm. But you made a good point, like equally important. I think also as you start to advance in your career and you move up the ladder, so to speak, you get more of those opportunities to lead trainings, right? To present in bigger meetings across the company. And you made a great point, like public speaking becomes more of a factor there. So there's plenty of different ways that you could improve on skills like that. But I think as you start to advance in your career, some of those things like more general and soft skills become more important than maybe earlier in your career where it's all about like nailing the foundation, learning the basics, and all that fun stuff.
Yeah. One thing that's come to mind is I kind of had this conversation with someone recently around the fact that right now it's a pretty intense time in the industry in a few different ways. You've got macro things going on. You've got a lot of industry change. We had Google Marketing Live last week. AI mentioned several thousand times. Like there's just so much disruption. So if you've got someone in an agency who's been there a couple of years and they're maybe a little bit stretched and they feel like they're just struggling to sort of get the basics done, how can you take a step back and have that growth mindset to be able to then do all this other stuff on top to like help you grow in your career? Is it that you're going to get points in time where things are stressful and then things will eventually calm down for just because it's cyclical? Or is there a way to take a step back from all the noise and sort of day-to-day messiness and sort of have that growth mindset? Like how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both of what you said, right? Like most agencies are very cyclical, and I tell this to my team all the time, but you're going to have that week where you might have 3 QBRs that you got to knock out, right? And then you might be really stretched thin that week. But then the following week, once you get through all those meetings, you might have a really light plate, right? So part of this, is finding that right balance so that you're at your best every week, right? And finding ways to fill the gaps when you do have a lighter week, when you have some more time on your hands. What's, where can you invest that time? So some things that I recommend are blocking off time every week for training. So no matter what the situation is, if you've got a 30-minute, an hour block on your calendar to do a training, to read industry news, whatever, just having that there kind of like builds that into your habits. And then another thing I would suggest is creating like a running list of trainings or books that you want to read, podcasts you want to listen to, YouTube channels, whatever, so that when you do have the time to invest, you're not wasting any time like looking for what you want to focus on. It's already mapped out, right? And you can just kind of plug and play.
Yep. Yeah, it's like it's so important to like try and take the friction out of the process for you to make it easy to do this stuff. And whether that's blocking out time where you've already got the things, resources, that makes a lot of sense.
For sure.
Yeah. The other thing that came to mind there was, and it's kind of hard to articulate this, but if you don't have a growth mind, let's just say you do the same tasks and processes week in, week out. If you were to take a step back and say, at a higher level, learn the importance of those things that helps you then prioritize, it means you then don't do certain things, or maybe you find a different way of doing things, you automate, you delegate. I guess what I'm trying to say is by going after the growth mindset and being able to get better at this stuff, it means you have less of that type of work below because you can better delegate, automate. Like you can kind of take a step back a little bit. So it's almost, it's difficult to help explain that, I think. But it's like you, in order to get out of this, you have to kind of have that pain of leveling up the thinking a little bit more so that you can reduce the amount of stuff you're doing, if that kind of makes sense.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think part of the growth mindset is also understanding that there's a lot of upfront time that's going to go into developing your skill set, right? But the whole point of doing that is that over time, it's going to free up more time, like you said, right? Whether it's getting more efficient at a task, whether it's, getting an opportunity to delegate that to somebody else, right? Or in today's day and age, finding a way to leverage AI, right? Like all those different things take time for you to figure out up front, but in the long run, they pay off. And ultimately, like when you're looking to advance your career, you have to be able to delegate or automate in order to take on more responsibilities, right? So like that's part of the process, is figuring out the best way to make that happen, and understanding that, yes, you might have to spend an extra 5 hours a week, training a new person to do some of the tasks that you've been working on. And a lot of people have resistance to that. Oftentimes you'll get somebody that has someone that they can delegate to, but you'll find that in the first couple of months, they don't really give them a whole lot of work, right? And a lot of the feedback that we usually get is like, well, I could do it in 20 minutes. Like, why would I spend an hour teaching them? Well, because over the course of the next 6 months, like you're going to save, that 20 minutes every week. That adds up to several hours, right? So you have to always zoom out and kind of think about things from the bigger picture.
Yeah. And for that for me comes back to, we're just creatures that love the easy route. Yeah. We'll default to the easy route more often than not. And that's why, I think personally for me, if I think of just an personal example, there are tasks and things I do that I will continue to do because it's a known task, it's a known process, it's easy. But then let's say there's more pressure applied in terms of I have a higher workload, that then forces me I have to take a step back and reassess, because otherwise I can't do it all. It's that pressure that makes me lean back and say, oh, actually, that thing I've been doing that takes like 5-10 minutes that I just do, there's a way to delegate that or automate that. It takes 10 seconds. But I don't do that until a different force comes in. And I think for a lot of people, that's probably the case, where it's like that added pressure on top makes you reassess. Yeah. For other people, I think to be an absolute master at it, you're the sort of person that does that all the time. You're just always reassessing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You kind of alluded to that earlier, but I think, self-reflection kind of dictates the rate of your growth, right? You're only kind of reflecting when you're in crisis, which, by the way, is often one of the worst times to reflect. You don't always think clearly when you're stressed or you're, under pressure, burnt out. But if you're able to like proactively set aside that time to reflect, maybe on like a monthly basis, like what are the things that I'm working on that I should probably be pushing off my plate, or am I really focused on the right priorities? Going back to like your goal setting at the beginning, right? Like what's the focus of the company for this year? What's my bigger picture focus? Am I still on track for, that larger goal that we're working towards, or am I getting lost in the weeds and losing focus on like what's really important?
Yeah. 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 It's a good point on the, just going back to the reassessing under a crisis is probably not the best time. It makes me think of the importance of actually setting aside as a team or an individual, setting aside time on a regular basis to actually reassess what you're doing, processes, automation, especially today, because things are moving so quickly with AI and automation. There are new tools coming out all the time, whether it's automating, calendar management, task management, or industry specific stuff within like Google Ads or Meta. These things are moving so quickly. You almost have to force yourself to every month, quarter, whatever it might be, maybe even every week, to take a step back as a team and be like, okay, what are we doing? What are the things we're doing today that next week we're probably going to be in a world where we shouldn't be doing that.
Yep.
And that's a very useful, really good use of time.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So that's 3, maintaining growth mindset. And then the fourth one we had was like separating yourself from the pack, which I feel like is a combination of the things we just talked about, but maybe elaborate that on a little bit more. What do you mean by like separating yourself?
Yeah. So we touched on a lot of this already, I think, but when it comes to separating yourself, you got to remember that, let's say you're on the paid search team, If you're at a smaller company, you might have a handful of people working alongside you. If you're at a bigger agency, there could be hundreds of people, right? The one thing that remains the same is that you need to be able to differentiate yourselves, whether it's from 3 other people or from 300 other people. And some of the ways that you can do that are, one, being innovative, right? So we talked about like that beta testing example at the beginning. What are things that you could do that other people haven't tapped into yet? Or it could be, different than that, in the sense of like everybody's been strictly running PMAX for their ecom accounts. What's a different approach? Could I come up with my own standard shopping campaign that actually outperforms like the setup that everybody else is doing? But finding ways that you can take your own path and kind of like create your own best practices. That's something that I always like to focus on is, Google's always going to have their recommendations for what works best. That's a great starting point, but don't take that as, your sole source of truth, right? There's always opportunity for you to test and to iterate off of that and put your own little spin on it and create your own best practice, right? And that's what'll differentiate you from everybody else who's following the same advice. Is maybe you took that and you put your own little spin on it, right? And then I think the other thing we talked about, which is a great way to separate, is finding your own little niche, right? So maybe there's an opportunity where you have a new client that came in and they are running on Apple Search, for example, and nobody else at the company has experience with Apple Search, but you raise your hand and you're like, hey, I'll go out and learn that. Now you've kind of created your own little silo, right, within the company. And if another client comes in that's also on Apple Search, you're the guy, right? Or you're the girl. So finding ways that you can kind of create value and separate yourself with the skill set that somebody else doesn't have is a great way to stand out.
Yeah. I think the way I'm kind of thinking about that is if what you do is largely defined by very tactical sort of building within the platform, I guess what I'm trying to say is you need to make sure a lot of the value you're bringing is from your thinking rather than your doing.
Yeah.
Because the doing is under threat right now. I mean, the thinking is under threat as well, but like the doing is definitely under threat. So if you are just doing stuff, then that's probably a bit risky. Instead, you want to be in a position where it's your thinking that brings value. And like, so whether that's what you know about Apple Search Ads because you're the Apple Search Ads person, or a different channel, I think that self-reflection, being able to self-reflect, am I just doing stuff for 90% of the day, or am I actually thinking about how to approach problems, critical thinking? Yeah, really important. Okay, cool. I think the other thing we kind of had in here was, I think it's really important, is managing up. So kind of being able to manage, communicate with people in and around you as a team, and especially upwards.
Yeah.
I think it's particularly interesting because as a manager, sometimes a lot of your or majority of your focus goes to areas where there are problems or things to solve. Generally, if things are going well, that probably gets less of your time as a manager in some cases.
Yeah.
And so that means that if you are someone who is, doing well and then you might not get a lot of attention. So it's good to like manage up to make sure that you have that visibility still. I think that's a big problem within agencies or just bigger teams generally, is like, as you grow up, you kind of, sometimes a lot of your time is spent with problems rather than, the stuff that's running itself. So managing up, super important.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that few people actually do, at least consistently, right? So that's just low-hanging fruit. And it's something that I would tell all my direct reports is like, hey, not a lot of people are managing up, right? So if you do take that extra step and you say, hey, here's what I'm really focused on, or here's what I need help with, right? It kind of cuts through some of the BS and lets us really focus our time on like, what's going to move the needle here, right? Instead of spending a one-on-one, trying to interview your direct report and like really uncover like what is that area that I can help with. It really helps to have them come to the table and just say like, hey, here's the one thing that we could do in the next 20 minutes that would really like make an impact on my week. And I think another element too that is overlooked there is providing feedback, whether it's to your manager directly or if it's like, hey, feedback on the direction that your department's heading in or things like that. It's something that not a lot of people do, right? Like when you're on the leadership team, it's very rare that people are coming to you and saying like, hey, I really think we could do this differently, or I think we could try this out and it might be better off, right? So if you're one of those few people that is voicing feedback and voicing ideas, I think that really does help you stand out, right? Because you're looking again to add value from your position and being like more in that win-win type of mindset.
Yeah. I'm wondering if the main reason, or one of the reasons that doesn't happen is just fear from maybe some of the things we talked about before.
Yeah.
Maybe feeling like it's a stupid suggestion or something along those lines. But the upside versus downside potential is like, it's so much more upside to being that person who is sharing ideas, thoughts, suggestions, even if, I mean, and they're almost never not, but even if some of them are a bit like not great, it's still way better just to share those things anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. That's awesome. Last one we had, a balancing work and tracking wins. So that's an interesting one. Maybe let's start with balancing work.
Yeah. So we kind of hit on this a little bit earlier, but I think it's important to recognize that there's going to be crazy weeks and then there's going to be some of the chill weeks that come up, right? And it's really important that when you're coming off of, a grind, you just had a couple of weeks where you put in a lot of hours, where you had a lot of intense meetings, whatever the case might be, you have to recognize that you can't continue to go in the same mode in perpetuity, right? You have to take advantage of those weeks where you don't have as much on your plate and take some time to recharge. I always tell people, like, if you can sign off early, then go sign off. Part of the advantage of working at an agency, and in particular in like either hybrid or remote settings, is that you have a lot of flexibility, right? And it's built in there for a reason, because we recognize that the agency life isn't easy. It's always going to present its own challenges, right? And the people that ultimately like succeed in it and are able to do it for a long time are ones that recognize that like burnout is real and that you need to take care of yourself. You need to take that time off, whether it's signing off earlier, or a lot of companies offer unlimited PTO. And believe it or not, most people don't take advantage of that, right? Like, I think it's often, there's studies out there that say like, if you have 2 weeks of PTO, people tend to take all of those 2 weeks. But if it's unlimited, they take less than 2 weeks. And it's just like that psychological thing, right? But it's important to recognize that flexibility is there for a reason, and you need to be able to take advantage of it, so that you're not putting yourself through the ringer every single week.
Yeah, it's a difficult balance. Yeah, I think everybody's different. Everyone has different thresholds, and so it's really important to bear that in mind. And like you say, take the time when you can to step back, recharge. Yeah, I think about that a lot, just because of sometimes the benefits to being able to take a step back from the situation and almost untangle your mind and then come back at it a little bit fresher to be like, okay, this is how we tackle this problem, this is how we make this better. And there's actually, it's way more beneficial to do that, take a step back, than to just keep plowing and keep working and keep trying to, move forward.
Yeah.
It's, the benefit of just stepping out of the weeds. I think that happens at every level. I think it's so easy to fall into that trap of you're just stuck in the day-to-day, and not taking, lifting your head above and taking a more holistic view or a high-level view to figure out these problems and sort of move things forward. So yeah, you can only really do that by taking that time. So it's super important.
Right.
Okay. And the second part was then tracking wins. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think this is another thing that's very much overlooked, but we talked this whole time about like how you can set yourself apart, how you can have that growth mindset, all that different stuff. It's really important though that you're also keeping track of this, right? One, so that you have those notes to go back to when you're doing a self-reflection, and you can kind of see like, hey, what have I actually done versus what we talked about or what I plan to do. But I think it's also really helpful to be able to share this with your manager, share this with your leaders, to make sure that everybody else is aware of what you're doing behind the scenes, right? So you could be going through trainings every single week. You could be, listening to podcasts, reading the news, all that stuff. But ultimately, if you're not sharing that, nobody else is really going to know, right? So you want to be able to keep track of everything that you're doing that's working. And when we're working within paid search, a lot of what we do is very quantifiable. So, I rolled out this test and I saw a 50% increase in ROAS with revenue improving 20%. You want to be really specific when you're tracking your wins to make them measurable, right? So try to draw back to the impact that they're having. And these are really helpful when it comes to performance reviews. A lot of times, you're doing a performance review every 6 months if you're lucky, once a year in most situations, right? And a lot of times when you're going through that, you can't remember what you did 6 months ago, right? But if you have a running list of all those things, it makes it really easy to go back and have like a thorough self-reflection on what worked well. And it's also what's going to be your best friend when it comes to getting that next promotion, getting that next raise, right? You can't go into a conversation like that and just say, hey, I've been working here for a couple of years and I feel like I've done really well, so I'd like another $10,000, please. People aren't going to really entertain that conversation. So if you're looking to get ahead in that way, you have to be able to back it up with numbers and be able to show the value that you've been adding.
And it's such a strong case then when you go to them and say, I've been working here a couple of years. I have demonstrated these qualities by doing this work, this project, that these are the results. These are things I'm doing. Here's the output. Here's the evidence.
Yeah.
It's pretty hard to then turn around and go, no. So,
right.
Yeah. And if they do, you should probably leave. So that's super important. I think how much of this is just comms and communication? I think it's just a really important point. It's something that I think that it took me personally a little bit of time to figure out in my career, that actually just a lot of comms is a big part of the game, both internally and externally. Right. And whether you're, being doing a job of communicating and articulating things to clients and selling to clients, that's probably the first thing you learn is important. That's kind of because it's so like immediate in that if you do a bad job, you kind of realize it. But if you do a bad job of communicating internally, sometimes it's a little bit harder to understand the implications of that. Yeah. So it takes a little bit longer to learn. So I think actually I probably learned it from other people telling me rather than like that self-reflection. It was more the people being like, this is really important. This is how you should do it. Yeah, it was really cool. Okay, awesome. That's all 5. So what did we have? We had, first was thinking big. So like aligning, if you can, your interests, what you're interested in, with the companies to make sure that you're all kind of in lockstep in terms of what the company's goals and aims are. Because aligning those two is really beneficial for you in your career. Leveraging resources, if you're a big agency, working with the teams, cross-department teams to learn what they're doing, find someone who maybe knows more about something than you do, connecting with them, getting over that fear of like reaching out to people cold in the agency and just, networking, make it two-way, make it beneficial. What can you do for them? The growth mindset, love that. I mean, you just have to have a growth mindset in this industry. Yeah. Otherwise it doesn't work. And obviously we talked about the importance of not just industry specific stuff, publications, betas, events, but also like the softer skills, public speaking, that kind of thing, really important. Separating yourself in the pack, which, a lot of this kind of helps to do, but also, and we talked about being proactive, but like also managing up and like communicating with your manager what's needed. That's really important as well. And then finally, the balancing work, tracking wins, which we just talked about. So yeah, really good framework. And I think personally, if I'd have had those 5 things outlined to me earlier on in my career, I definitely would have found that very beneficial. So that's awesome. Anything else you'd add before we wrap up?
I would just kind of tie a bow on it by saying, when we go back to the first thinking big part of it, that also comes into play when you're looking for that promotion or you're looking for that raise, is thinking about what's the right time to strike, right? And having a pulse on how the company is performing can really influence, your chances of success when it comes to getting a raise or getting promoted. If your company is doing really well and landing a bunch of clients, probably a good time for you to have that conversation and to show some of the wins that you've had that contributed to the success. But on the contrary, if you've got a, list of 10 things that you've done amazing, but the whole company hasn't been succeeding, you have to have that context that your chances of, having a productive conversation probably aren't that great, right? Because at the end of the day, it's all a partnership between you and then the company you're working for.
Yeah, it's really important, and it can be hard to find that balance sometimes, and kind of read the room. I guess in the extremes, loads of client wins, easy, loads of client yeses, yeah. But in this grey area between that, I guess it can be tricky. But to your point, the best opportunity you can give yourself is just by listening and like taking in what you can around like how the company's doing. List these all hands. And I really like the point you made there, just about how it's a partnership. I've been with the agency I work at for over 8 years, and there's that's a long commitment. It's a long time in agency world, but it's multiple reasons. They've given me a good career. I like working with the people. It's always been very interesting, intellectually stimulating. The company's always been growing. And there's been hard times when you sort of second guess where you should be and if you should try somewhere else. But it is a partnership, and sometimes those things, what they get better with time.
Right.
And I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, you shouldn't necessarily jump ship within like 6 months or 12 months just because things aren't working perfectly the way they are, because you're never going to get a stretch of time where it's going to work perfectly throughout. Agencies have the same problems. You kind of have to stick through the hard times to then get the benefits of the good times. And there are benefits to being loyal and staying at a place. So I get that's a balance, but I guess my main point is not sort of throwing the towel in too early when you're working at an agency.
For sure.
Yep. Awesome. This is really great, really useful. So I appreciate you coming on and talking us through it. So thanks, Eric.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Had fun.